Hi, there's someone else.
I'm Khawla, how are you?
Well,
Khawla is a active follower on Twitter. She's very interesting. She's doing her PhD in politics, and she did her MA and BA in politics as well. And she's actually working on a gender-related issue right now. Do you want to mention more about it? Your work, Khawla?
Yeah, sorry, my son is here with me, so if you hear him, he's saying hi to y'all. So I'm actually on the hiring committee right now for a new position in my institution, which is it's called Gender, Post-Colonialism, and Islamic World. And so it's right in line with my own research on Libya, revolution, and gender. And so, yeah. Hi, it's nice to see you all and meet you virtually.
Super interesting.
sounds amazing.
I love it.
Yeah. We want to hear more about it. You should join us on the panel.
Yes, I want to hear about it too.
Yeah, in future, join us on the panel. Like, help steer the discussion with us if you have time, of course.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Osama, we're going to start a gender series for Arab Bureau.
You're more than welcome.
Just get ready.
No, you're more than welcome to.
The decision has been made. We're 5 minutes into the call and the decision has been made.
No problem. It's 4 against 1, so I can't.
Can we vote? Yes, I vote. I vote yes.
Okay. Fine, no problem.
Well, we saw your hands up too, Osama, and actually 2 of them. So that's from you.
Is it surrender or is it double approval?
It's a bit of both. I do feel slightly intimidated, but that's fine. That's fine. There's no problem with that. So Khawla, just...
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Osama, just a question hit my head when you were saying that. Do you think differently when you're speaking to an Arab woman and non-Arab woman when you're thinking about this stuff?
That's very interesting.
Like, is it in the back of your head because you know stereotypically how a Arab woman would think, and then you talk to her according to that kind of thing?
No, I don't think differently. And the reason why is because I think that, and I actually have this opinion, I'm not just saying it because the chat is not dominated by women, but I think that gender oppression is more significant than racial oppression against Arabs, because there is an oppression against Arab ethnicity in some Western institutions, or many Western institutions, but in the Arab world, very often the power dynamic is reversed, whereby Arabs can oppress other ethnicities, whereas with gender, women are always on this other side of oppression, whether they're in the Arab world or not. So I think when I talk to an Arab or non-Arab, or Muslim or non-Muslim woman, it's the same for me. That's my view. Do you agree with that summary, or do you challenge any of it?
When you said this, it's like layers of oppression, and there's like higher levels at some point. Like sometimes you might be discriminated more because you're Muslim, and sometimes you're Arab. Being Arab comes first, and then being woman comes first. But yeah. I completely agree that these 3 main layers that are a combination of how a woman could be oppressed in different shades.
Yes.
Like if she's Muslim in a non-Muslim world, if she's in a patriarchal world, or if she's an Arab in a non-Arab world. But in general, the essence is gender oppression on women is a core, and then there would be other tentacles attached to it, if you might say. And then it becomes a combination of things, depending on the context.
Shatha, yeah.
Do you feel similarly when you're speaking to an Arab man? Like the same question?
Yes, I add a different layer because I had terrible experiences. I take them on a patriarchal background that also they are all on the same scale for me. Like I take that, like I put them on the patriarchal scale first. So I think of that first, but then I add a different layer of my own context, because I know Arab men more than non-Arab ones. So I've had contact with so many, but yeah, because I had different experiences, so I build up on my experiences on different things. So yes, definitely there is an additional layer I don't think of with them. Like I don't discuss with them something that has to do with gender fluidity, for example, things we discussed, or something that is a bit different. So it's, yeah, definitely there is a different layer in.
My dad used to tell me, when you want to challenge and change any type of social oppression and any type, don't come to the wall from the middle and start like breaking it. You have to come from the side. And so that's I guess what you're trying to say is that, for example, gender fluidity, you're not going to come to a society that has the concept of gender in itself hasn't been, I guess the construction of it hasn't been examined deeply, and then be like, well, here's the thing, gender is fluid, and that's not like, that shock to the system isn't necessarily productive at all the time.
No.
So yeah, I see that.
I cannot start saying gender is fluid here. I could start something about freedom. I can talk about choice. I can talk about
Right.
self-exploration. I can talk about identity. I can talk about different angles that are, like you said, on the edge rather than in the center, because that doesn't work the same.
So I was thinking also while you were asking Osama that question, and then Shatha, is that your name? Yeah. Shatha was asking you that question as well. I was thinking also about like Arab women to Arab women. You know, we have internalized patriarchy ourselves in a lot of ways, more so than even the men, you know, like our moms, how they treat our brothers versus us, and like how you have to do everything for the man, and etc. And you're internalize that and condition that from your mother a lot of the times. And so in talking to my mom, how I navigate certain topics around gender and like women's rights, I guess you can say. I mean, I use that very in quotations because I do not adhere to like liberal feminism at all. But and so, you know, like how we navigate in talking to other Arab women and their internalized patriarchy and our own internalized patriarchies. I mean, I even have, and I'm trying to unravel that with time. So yeah, that in itself is like a whole other discussion.
Can I ask
I'm not
Jennifer?
sorry,
Yeah.
just very quickly, because it it links directly to what Laila, Shatha, and Hola have been saying. So I'm not an Arab woman, right? But I have experience in engaging with Muslims as well, with Muslims and with Arabs as well. And I have kind of like started adopting this kind of filter too, right? Of speaking in a certain way when I know that someone is either a Muslim or an Arab, right? And this actually is going to be interesting once we start speaking about the difference between religion and culture, right? And then there were some situations where, for one reason or another, I did actually get rid of the filter, either because I was just tired and of pretending to, well, not pretending to be someone else, but like filtering yourself so much, or in some situations because I just didn't know that they were Arab or Muslim, right? Like speak about, I don't know, blonde Syrian guy, and my unfiltered self just comes out until I'm like, oh my god. Wait a second. But then these experiences have shown me that it can actually be okay, and some people can actually deal with the full package, right? And maybe that's also because it's not just about culture and religion and gender, but there's other aspects as well, such as education and class, also the context where the interaction takes place, right? So in a professional context, it might be more possible to speak about some aspects of gender theory, right? Whereas maybe, I don't know, with your father's uncle's friend, it might not actually work that well. So I think context is also really, really important.
Also, I mean, these problems are not just specific to the Arab and Muslim world. It's universal. I mean, patriarchy exists in every single corner in the world. I mean, I live in the United States, and you see, you know, marriage, like child marriages, take place in more than 30 states. So you can get married at 16 just by the consent of your parents in America, right? The supposed free world, you know, the leader of the free world. But so it's very important to contextualize and say and not create a sui generis case for the Arab slash Muslim world and claim that patriarchy just exists there, misogyny exists there, because I think it's much more universal than that. And it's important that to note that we all get socialized, whether men and women, in these patriarchal realms. Yeah.
As an external viewer, I think that I agree with Shatha that there is patriarchy in all cultures, pretty much, with the exception if you look at an ancient point in Egyptian history where there was certain periods of matriarchy. Generally speaking, there is patriarchy in all cultures, but it manifests itself differently depending on where it is. So, for example, I don't see how, if I walk into a shop and I see overly sexualized marketing that's kind of, when you're with family, it's inappropriate. You don't really need to, there's some things that don't need to be marketed in that way, right? I don't see why that's necessary. I actually view this as a form of gender oppression. It's basically objectifying women and using them as a commodity to sell a product. However, I think certain Western commentators tend to come at this discussion from a bit of a high horse, where they assume that the Western world is completely free of its own manifestation of patriarchy, and it's all about the Middle East and how the Middle East is patriarchal. There's a blind spot, I think.
Like, have any of you guys watched the documentary Misrepresentation? So it's the documentary is about basically how we socialize and condition children into gender roles. So how do we, when you have a baby girl versus a baby boy, how do you, like, you get the baby boy little cars and guns, and then you get the baby girl like dolls and whatnot. So like you kind of condition them to become to fulfill these gender roles that are expected and constructed by society. So when I was in college, the director of Misrepresentation came to my school, and she was supposed to give a presentation. So I went to the lunch before, and I sat next to her. So she said, introduce yourself. And I said, my name is Shatha and I'm from Libya. So she said, oh, your country is in severe need of feminism. And so that ticked me off, of course, and I got really offended. But so like when she gave her presentation in front of the entire school, she said, who considers themselves feminists and who does not? So I put my hand under the who does not. Now, mind you, I do consider myself a feminist, but just because of that, my understanding of how she defined feminist, I didn't agree. So I said no. So when she asked me why I don't consider myself feminist, it was the same thing. As I told her, well, if by feminism we're using overly sexualized images of women to sell a car, then my country doesn't need feminism, because we don't put overly sexualized pictures and videos of women in order to sell a car in the streets or on the market. So in that context, I do not need saving, right? Or we do not need saving. So that definitely exists. It's very problematic, and it comes, I think it comes from the concept of Orientalism too. I would argue there's that image of what it means to be Arab and Middle Eastern, that we're very oppressed and we need saving. And I think Condoleezza Rice made that in her speech. She kind of went through that rhetoric and saying that Afghan women need to be liberated. And so yeah, that's extremely problematic.
Yeah.
Yes, go on, Hoda. Yeah, please.
No, I was just, the whole savior, the white male, or and even the white woman savior, like liberal feminists are always trying to save the other. It's rooted in colonialism. And if you look at patriarchy before colonialism, it was a very different kind of patriarchy. And it wasn't as oppressive as patriarchy is today, especially in the Arab world. There was gender roles, but they were equally valued. And so with patriarchy, with these gendered and like racial hierarchies that came with it, colonialism and the gendered and racial hierarchies that came with it, came this new form of patriarchy, which we've internalized. And then the savior of like the Muslim woman from the Muslim man, and the brown woman from the brown man. And we see that also internalized within our own communities, like even in Canada, about like the banning of the headscarf in Quebec. And then also, like in a more broad sense, you see it in terms of like Stephen Harper, the old conservative later, he tried to like come up with all these bills, like Bill 70, which kind of was like banning barbaric practices. And what are these barbaric practices? And what are they constituted under? And they're always, it's just like, you know, neo-colonialism is continually being refurbished in today's society. And like this, and then, but like when you trace patriarchy, it comes from the West. Like patriarchy as we know it today, it comes and is rooted from the West and colonialism. So it's just very like, you know, mind-blowing really.
I would,
sorry, Laila, just before you come in, I just wanted to ask ML if she has a different experience, because ML is, if she doesn't mind me mentioning, she's about 18 years old, so she's from a different generation to myself. I'll speak for myself, so don't.
Hey, Osama, I was just
from
going
myself.
to say, did you just say you were old?
I said from myself. Okay.
Just for yourself. The rest of us is 14.
So yeah, I was wondering if ML has a different experience in this.
Sorry, a different experience, like with what point exactly?
Do you everything that was mentioned by Khawla, Shatha, Jennifer, and Laila, do you relate with, or was there anything they mentioned that you don't relate with?
Everything. I think everything they mentioned is right. Like I think it's always painted like that Muslim women need like saving in whatever way, when they don't. Sorry, you know your point earlier where it was about marketing, like sometimes things are overly sexualized in marketing. I do have a problem with that, but like I think most of society doesn't have a problem with that. But what they do have a problem is when women capitalize off like their sexuality themselves, like Instagram models or whatever, when they use it to sell a product. People have a lot more issue with that than they actually do when women are being used to, like usually by men, to sell a car or whatever.
Yeah.
People tend to have it more when it's the woman capitalizing off it. So I don't know. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And we spoke about that last time as well, didn't we? Yeah. Laila, you were going to say something.
I'm just reflecting. Everything you're saying is so rich, but I wanted to say exactly what Khala was saying. It's like we're talking about it from very different points. Like I could spin them into three, maybe four. But the first one is, I agree with you, Osama. It's very Eurocentric way of defining what is very based on that. How do you define patriarchy and how it is? But it's also the look and the Orientalist, like Shatha said. But then I would agree again with Khawla that the post-colonial, and especially in the places where there has been very long-term post-colonial impact, just like if you talk about India, or if you talk about Palestine, the post-British mandate, for example, which has left more entrenched way of that. And I have two examples thinking of it. The first one is, for example, if you add to that layer Palestine, when we talk about how women are oppressed and how colonialism and post-colonialism has affected that. So for example, when the occupation came, when the Israeli occupation inherited colonialism from the British and the many others here in Palestine, they've added another layer. They enabled patriarchy in some way. So they gave it more of an enabling environment. Because, for example, when it becomes, there's a threat from Israeli illegal settlers or an Israeli checkpoint, the women are less enabled to do so. So you're not allowed to go out because there are Israeli soldiers. You're not allowed to go at night because there's danger and security. You're not allowed because you need to protect your children, because you need to, and then the woman conditions itself because of occupation. I cannot do this, but I'm doing something. So we condition ourselves that we're doing something greater, but at the same time, we're being held more. And this enables patriarchy to take place. And going back to what Shatha was said, I had a very striking example of how we can shake that. And this brings me to the last point, which I totally believe in. It's about how do you change this mainstreaming, or how do you change these very early stereotyping that gets into a girl's life or a boy's life. And it happened to me like in two different occasions, but I'll describe the most embarrassing one. So it was a Good Friday. I'm Christian, so it was Good Friday. We're going to church, and I had my niece that Osama was asking about. So my favorite niece, she's with me, she's stuck with me. She likes to go with her auntie, and we're getting into church, and it's packed. You know, like it's festive, and everybody is there, but it's Good Friday. Everybody is silent. So we're getting into a very sacred moment. And because the church was And evidently, because culturally it was separated, so men are on one side and women are on one side. So we go in, they had to mix us a bit, and we're closer to the men's side because there's not enough room. So we go in, and she sees a man with a ponytail in the church, and she's like 4 or 5, I cannot remember, and she shouts, like at the top of her lungs, like, "Oh my God, look, auntie, he has a ponytail like girls." It's like we're mid church, and she says that very loud. And I say in Arabic, so he's like, "Na'am abuki." Like I curse her father. Is like, "Okay, habibti, it's okay." And then I had to do her, like I had to make a lesson for her and all the other nephews and nieces, like boys can have their long hair, girls can have short hair. And I had shorter hair then, and they struggled even accepting me with shorter hair. Like they heard from each other, like, "Amto, I don't like your short hair, maybe it should be longer." And I had this discussion with them, like I mainstreamed it into all their discussions. I had to say, like, it's okay for a girl to have a short hair. Who says she needs or she must have a long hair? And then it goes to colors, to the play, to the toys, to everything. And it's so difficult to challenge this. I mean, like a 4-year-old can tell me, my niece is like, "No, I don't want my cousin to play with me. It's a pink toy, it's for girls." And it strikes you like it starts so entrenched into the culture of education. It gets mainstreamed in the little things, and even jokes. Sometimes I challenge people, going to our earlier discussion, challenging people on social media. I challenge people who put like jokes on women driving. It's like, no, you cannot do that, because this joke becomes a culture. This joke becomes funny, but then it gets stuck into your head that women actually cannot drive because they are women, not because they're bad at driving that specific individual. And for me, this is what happens. These components get together and they get entrenched into the culture more than a religion, because I believe the culture is a bigger vessel for religion, beliefs, gender, and other ones, because there's a different culture of something. So, for example, if you say Arab Muslim women and then you say non-Arab Muslim women, it's a totally different culture, which makes sense. In a previous job, I used to work with Osama. We used to have online video conferencing and dialogue with students around the world, and I witnessed dialogues of Muslim students in Jordan who speak Arabic. They're Arabic Muslim with non-Arabic Muslims in Indonesia. And it was so totally different speaking to both of them. Like both groups were like, they were learning about each other, because it was really funny. Like the students would talk about their festivals. And the students from Indonesia, they would say, "Oh, my favorite festival is Eid al-Fitr." And the students were sitting like this, the Arabs, they didn't even realize it was Eid al-Fitr, which comes after Ramadan. And it's breaking that kind of culture, because these components can do this kind of stuff. And then in the upbringing, in the education, in the mainstreaming of stereotyping, all of these notions, this is where we compose all these kind of stuff. So every component that comes in adds another layer for me. Like post-colonialism, I agree with Khawla so much. And then the education and the stereotyping that builds up, and then the conditioning the women have to do, and then the patriarchy that sometimes is empowered by these components, and then the other places. So we see, for example, the blow against Muslim people who they say, or they mention, they claim they came and claimed Europe. Because if you look also at, sorry, I'm taking this too long, but if you look also at the history of post-colonialism and the Eurocentral idea of patriarchy and how it changed, and the Enlightenment, and then the taking out religion out of the picture, and then it becomes something that and then another like religion comes back to Europe in a different shape. And this is where and it changes for me, basically, just to finish up with this idea, is it's like the culture and the context that these components would come in together and create that kind of condition where you are. Are you accepted as a Muslim European in Europe? Are you accepted as more as an Arab Muslim? Are you accepted as a woman without these components? Or if you are all of them, how do they treat you? How do they look at you? For example, for me, I would end up, it's different for me, because I get treated differently, because they think I'm Muslim because I'm Palestinian. They take me out of context because, oh, you're Palestinians or you're Muslims. Like, no, and then I have to explain this kind of identity inside of me. And I think I talk too much, sorry, but it's like all these components together that create this culture and upbringing
You
where
know,
mainstream.
Laila, I think you mentioned something really interesting, which is that in the Palestinian church, the men and women are separate, and you see, this is the thing. Like, there isn't much.
It's Arab culture because it's not because people perceive Christianity as something European, but they forget that we are Arab by culture.
Exactly.
And all our behaviors are so Arab. We're very conservative in dressing. We're very conservative. We're very firm on women and gender. We kill girls sometimes. Like, we have incidents where girls were killed because they've done something, or they are outspoken about their sexuality. It's not something that we talk about because we are in an Arab culture. We're Arabs first,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
we are Christians.
Well, this is the thing. It's not clear to me the extent to which Arab or Islamic culture has influenced this, because, for example, in Morocco, in a lot of the mosques, they separate the men and the women, but the women pray on the top floor, so they don't pray behind the men, right? And I believe Talha is in the chat, he will know more about this, but I believe that historically, that used to be the case in many ancient Arab mosques, where the women wouldn't necessarily pray behind, but they may pray to the side, or they would pray on the top floor. So it could be Arab culture that's influencing this, the segregation in churches in Palestine, or Islamic culture, but it's not clear to me. I don't know if anyone else has an opinion, maybe Syria, for example.
It still happens in lots of other parts of the world. So I notice women praying above men. I notice from Turkey too. And I think in Kuwait, I know of at least one mosque where they actually pray side by side. The main mosque, even if I'm not the central.
Is it mixed, or is it left and right, like one?
No, it's left and right. It's not mixed.
Yeah,
they pray, at least in Ramadan. Oh my God, I don't know. I shouldn't have said. But I don't think it's just a Moroccan thing.
Absolutely.
I wanted to comment on what Laila was saying about this difference between culture and religion, because I think it's a really, really important point, and I think it often gets overlooked, right? So when I was preparing for the talk, this is one of the things that I said, okay, that is really, really, really key to take into account if we speak about religion, culture, and gender, right? I think a lot of people don't get this right. They just assume, there's also this assumption that Christianity is Western per se, right? And that Arabs are Muslim. I remember a couple of years ago when we had these huge debates about refugees coming into Europe from the Middle East and South Asia. There were people in Germany, where I'm from, who were saying, oh, let's just take in the Christians because integration will be easy. And it made me laugh, because clearly they didn't know what they were talking about, right? But it's so widespread. This assumption that there's an overlap between culture and religion, and it's just not the case.
I can add to what Jennifer you were saying, and responding to Osama's question, is also it's all about class. So, for example, in cities, you would see churches, people are mixed. If you see it in a village, in a small village where I come from, it's separated. It's also about with the culture that is like urban and non-urban. We come from a small village where people have a different culture from a big city where people are more modernized, let's say, or in a different place where mixing people is different. Because for us, we live in a culture where if somebody or a stranger comes in, the men sit with them, and then the women would be separated as well. So it's part of a holistic culture in wherever that you are. So if you're in the city, it's more comfortable to sit with men, if not. So it's also about class and adding all these other differences.
I mean, a culture in itself. I mean, for me, the way I think about religion and culture, or like, for example, when we have discussions with friends and family about religion, at least in the context of Islam, the history of it, and whether, like there are these arguments that claim that a lot of religions are patriarchal in nature, and so like I challenge that argument, though there is some truth to it, but it's still worth challenging. So, for example, like when we look at the history of Islam, and there's definitely an there's evidence for different differences in in genders between men and women, absolutely. And so I was angry with that for a while, that like how, as a Muslim woman, how do I prescribe to a religion that historically, for example, had some part of oppression, like for example, what do you call them, al-jawari? So I don't know what that is in English. In any case, so I came to peace with it by looking at religion in the historical sense from the context of culture. So culturally, during that time, that's what was known. These were the norms and these were the values. And so religion it doesn't come in a mutually exclusive bubble. It doesn't exist just on its own. It exists within the context of culture. So evidently it's going to progress and change through the culture. So from the time of the Prophet to now, Islam is not the same, and the Arab culture, whatever that is, it's no longer the same. So that even just defining culture, like putting it in some sort of a one narrative, is very problematic. And so like that's why I often, when I think of religion and culture, I think of I forgot his first name, but Tweed, who created a theory of religion, and he says that he defines religions with an S to be confluences of organic cultural flows. That's how he defines religions. And that
I think for me it would also be important to distinguish between lived religion, right, and how people practice religion, and then theology on the other hand.
Yes.
I feel often people speak about religion and they don't really clearly define their terms. And they might disagree on something, and the only reason for the disagreement is that one of them is speaking about theology and one of them is speaking about how people practice this religion, right? Which might be in line with the theological principles, or maybe not, right?
And then I think that's like that comes from the assumption of a monolithic community, that like all Muslims must, or all Christians must follow the same thing, and therefore, you know, whatever as a community practitioners do, it reflects the theology. I think that's the assumption. And at least in the context of Islam, I find it extremely problematic when they say Muslims. I mean, what is Muslim and who is Muslim?
And even in theology, there's diversity, right? I mean, especially if you speak about Islam, but also even Christianity as well. There's diversity as well, even on a theological level. So
it's, I think, combining that, Jennifer, I think you said something very interesting about people take some religious practices and they take them as a religious culture, and then becomes the culture of something, and then it gets referred to religions like, no, this is how we should do that as Muslims, but then it's actually a practice, not something part of the theology that you could refer to, and then this is where it gets mainstreamed, and then this is where it gets pinned on to say all Muslims should do this and this and that, because it became a culture somehow, because the practices were taken away and they don't do the distinction or definitions inside any religion, which is really interesting. And it's in many religions, not only Islam, but also Christianity. It becomes a culture of not distinction only, but discrimination. Like they use that in a negative way, where they take it as like, all Muslims do that, or all Muslims say that. So for example, I'd say that it's a safe space to say that, but sometimes it's taken, like we had an argument, because we usually get that. It's sometimes we get discriminated against, like if somebody dies and it's in the news and it's somebody Christian, and then you go into comments and it happened once. It's like, oh, you shouldn't say God have mercy on their soul because they're not Muslims. Or if they want to say a dua, or they want to do a prayer, it's like, oh, God save all the Muslims, or have mercy on the Muslim dead only. And then it becomes specific, and some people get angry. And this anger becomes like, oh, we're discriminated against, they hate us, they don't like us, they only say that like, oh, God save the Muslims and not the other ones, etc. But then I say, it's my understanding of it, it's like, it's a culture. It's like it began maybe in a mosque, somebody is praying in a Friday prayer and says, and this does this dua for the Muslims because they are praying doing that, and then becomes a culture, and then becomes prevalent, but then it becomes overthinking, where it has more impact rather than being it could be, for me, it means somebody is wishing, like wishing well for all the Muslim fellows from the same belief. But for others, it looks like they're only wishing that for themselves. What do they mean? Do they mean that they wish worse or bad for the other ones? So it's practices that are taking against religion itself. So Islam doesn't say they want only to have mercy on Muslims. They want to have mercy on all the people. Doesn't matter. But if somebody takes this practice and uses it against the religion itself. And this is where the divide happens, where the practices and cultures of people of that religion is taking against the religion itself. And we see that in many places, even with the Christians as well, in other examples.
And that's where context becomes so important again, right? Like you could say something that would make complete sense within an, let's say, Muslim-only space, right? Let's say, I don't know, a country where you literally have only Muslims, and but that would be a very specific context, right? So maybe they would say it there and they wouldn't give it another thought because everyone would understand what they mean by it. But then if you said something like this in a multicultural society, right, in a multi-ethnic or multi-religious society, then clearly it would cause offense because it just wouldn't work, right?
But sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes, for example, I'm more comfortable expressing my opinion that I strongly, genuinely believe with somebody like Laila, who's an Arab Christian, or somebody like Shatha, who has a very specific North African take of Islam, than with Muslims who can disregard my opinion, and sometimes that closes the discussion. And if another Muslim thinks that my opinion on these issues is wrong, then they've eliminated all possibility of correcting or refining my perspective by not engaging in the conversation, right? Now, I agree with what Shatha's saying, that I disagree with the whole Islamic reform movement that, you know, some people are trying to push right now. But I do believe in contextualizing Islam. And I think I admire what Shatha said, because she's been very honest, which is that, yes, it's not all roses. Sometimes it is difficult to square Islam with your commitment to certain other philosophical ideals that you have.
But if someone decides if someone is trying to like come to grips with these questions, which are really big questions, I agree, right? Mm-hmm. And then some people might come to the conclusion that, okay, no, this is not for me. Then it's fine, and it's not an expression of immaturity. It's their choice.
Okay, let me refine my. So I agree with you that there are, okay, not just the example you've given where someone genuinely just thinks, you know what, it's not for me, right? But there are also examples where somebody actually really struggles in their Muslim community and feels like they have to leave, right? So I don't mean to belittle that experience. I guess what I'm talking about specifically is a very, very specific form of ex-Muslim movement where it's more about kind of having a platform to speak. So there are a few commentators that come to mind, but I think that if I mention them, we're going to open the discussion a bit too widely. But I think that one shouldn't just think about their own oppression and their own liberation in determining which groups they now identify with, but they should also think about the contribution they make to other people's liberation when they make that transition. That's all I'm saying. More consideration, I think, needs to be made.
No.
But so, but the problem is it's very contextualized in that sense. I wanted to ask you a question. Do you think, for me, like it's very also country specific. If you want to take our world, I don't say the same phrase in Egypt the way I say it in Lebanon, the way I say it in Jordan, the way I say it in Palestine, because it's about that. What you're saying is they're rejecting the whole, like I'll give you an example. In Palestine, for us, freedom is sacred. If you talk about freedom, we say about freedom, we preach people about freedom. But you go sometimes into the Palestinian society, they reject some other Palestinians because they have different beliefs. They reject political opinions. They reject like gender opinions. They reject essential opinions that would say something no to their religion or to their things. I mean, we had a problem like years ago. I cannot remember when did the US legitimize the gay marriage, for example. And it was for us, it was very symbolic of how this great movement had done so much, and they've gone so so well advanced into getting something they wanted. It's part of freedom, and for me, freedom is not segregated. You cannot say I want freedom for Palestine and then you oppress other people because they have an opinion about something. And there was a Palestinian painter. He thought it was very symbolic. He drew the, you know, like the flag, the I'm sorry, what do you call it? I forgot the name for it. So it's the colorful flag of the gay people. So
the rainbow.
The rainbow. So
Rainbow.
he drew the rainbow on the segregation wall that separated Ramallah from Jerusalem. It's part of the big separation wall, and it was so symbolic. It was so, for me, it was so beautiful because at that, it's like to send a message to the world about this. And some people had so much trouble with it. They went at night and they painted over it white because they rejected the idea. And to be honest, for me, I was so angry because you cannot say you want freedom. For example, you cry for a value and then you say it's okay for this value to go. It's like, how do you want to be accepted if you don't accept people? But Osama, for me, the way, I don't know if I got you right. It's thinking about something more holistic than your own view. But for me, in the Arab world, and even this, if we come back to the coronavirus, which should be also the core of our discussion, it has caused people to go back, to regress more to their origins. Like, for example, our professor at the university, she said a remark which was really very insightful of her. Like, when they talked about the corona and the lockdown, etc., everybody went to their core families. Everybody went to their core existences. For example, I live in the city alone, I work. When they announced the coronavirus lockdown, I went back and I sat with my mom. I went to my family. Everybody wanted to go home. It became less globalized now because it became back to other origins. And I think this is part of the problem when you want to solve it on a global way. It's very contextualized, and for the Arab world specifically, it's very country specific. Like, especially these three terms, they're very country specific. I would discuss them very differently in various contexts. I wouldn't say Arabs in general, because there are also other specific contexts or other countries.
Shatha, I'm really I will be quiet after this. I just need to defend myself. Okay, so I think it's.
I don't want you to be quiet. I was gonna actually. Can I follow up on what you were saying? Correct me if I understood you wrong, Osama. But I think what you were trying to say is that I think that what you disagree with or find problematic, if I may choose that word, is the blocking of dialogue and conversation. So like those who chose to say, okay, Islam is not for me or Christianity is not for me and I'm going to get out of it. Not that that's a sign of immaturity, but more the fact that just blocking that conversation and say, okay, now that I'm an ex-Muslim or now that I'm an ex-Christian or whatever, now I'm going to move to that platform and completely disregard and not engage in conversations.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yes, it's sometimes it can be a sign. Sometimes it can be a sign of immaturity. Not the majority of times. Sometimes, but you're right. And also, look, the person that comes to mind, the example that comes to mind is Ayan Hirsi Ali, or Ali Hirsi, right? Now, I find her views very problematic because I don't understand what she's trying to achieve. Are you trying to improve the condition of Black Muslim women? Or are you trying to sell a book, right? Or do you have a journey of liberation that you genuinely struggle with, okay? I think it's a combination of point 2 and point 3, okay? And the reason I say this is because when you disregard your culture, you come out of it, you don't engage with the problematic people in your culture, you talk to the ideological echo chamber that would agree with you anyway and will not substantially alleviate the problem for other people like yourself, and you assume that, for example, female genital mutilation is a Muslim specific thing, and you go down and you peddle this narrative and you paint it. For example, I didn't know about FGM until I heard Ayan talk about it. Like this, I know that in Egypt it's an issue, in Somalia it's an issue, in Ethiopia it can be. I'm not sure what the stats are in Ethiopia. In Morocco, I was completely unaware of the discussion. Then suddenly I deal with Islamophobes online who tell me that it's in my culture that all women are treated in this way, right? So she's peddling an irresponsible narrative that actually exacerbates the oppression of Muslim women. Be nuanced about it, be responsible about it, and think about your impact on other people. It's not just, and just one last thing, right? It's not as simple, you cannot, this is a controversial point. Jennifer's going to disagree with this, right? Now, I don't think you can just...
Are you sure you want to do this, Osama? Are you sure you want to go there?
Look, I don't think you can just leave Islamic culture or leave your identity. There are parts of Islamic culture that are beyond the religion, that are ingrained in the way that you say salam to somebody, or the way you eat at the table, or the way you communicate. It's intersectional. We've all agreed in this chat that culture and religion have overlaps, right? You can...
But is it, Osama, is it Islamic culture, or is it Arab or Oriental or Middle Eastern culture? Because would you see, I mean, I know Chinese Muslims, right? So if you decide you don't want to be a Muslim anymore, right? Like maybe a lot about the way that you behave, that you think, your attitudes, norms, expectations, all of that, maybe that wouldn't change a lot, but that's because you're still Arab or North African or whatever, right?
Yes, but...
Yeah, but a Chinese Muslim, if he stopped being Muslim, right, like it would be different because his culture is different. It was like the example that Laila gave earlier about who was it, like Muslims from different parts of the world? Was it Malaysia? You mentioned Malaysia. Indonesia, exactly. So they're so different. Oh my God, like they're so different, right?
But I tell you something, Jennifer, from like an Arab perspective. For me, it's difficult to distinguish Arab culture and Islamic culture because sometimes it's seen as one, and it's going back into history, and I think it's related to the civilization where this grew. That's why I'm saying sometimes it's country specific, but in general, Arabs themselves, like it's not a generalization, but I believe that we have an issue or a challenge to distinguish this kind of fine line between them. Is it a culture thing? Is it an Islamic thing? Because we say Islam, like when I define myself, I say I am Palestinian, I'm Christian by identity and religion, but I am Muslim by culture, because like Muslim Palestinian, because sometimes they try to pick on this, like saying, oh, but you're Christian and it's different for you. It's like, no. For me, example, I was like, I don't celebrate Christmas, Ramadan, but for me, Ramadan is very special because it's part of my rituals, it's part of my culture, it's part of what I do as a Palestinian.
I get it.
And it's that fine line where I think it's difficult to distinguish.
Jennifer, what I'm saying is, okay, I'm not trying to say don't leave Islam if you disagree with it. You should be philosophically sincere. Leave it if you disagree with it and you want to leave it. However, you don't need to make a point
don't become an annoying ex-Muslim, basically.
No, not even that. Not even that. Don't assume that adopting a Judeo-Christian Judeo-Christian secular atheist culture is a neutral position. So deliberately make a point of eating pork and whatever.
Sama, I'll give you an example. I gave you a live example. We had a discussion previously on this. It's some people, like they would say, I have like friends from like Muslims and ex-Muslims, Christian, ex-Christians, and like different beliefs, and when they talk about this and we speak about dialogue and respect and how do you create a safe space, it's like disagreeing with something. I remember now, this is recording, I'm not going to say who. So we were in a family gathering and we were discussing some kind of discussions, and one of my relatives was attacking the Christian believers and what they were saying, and I said, but this is the point. You have all the liberty to believe whatever you want to believe, but you're not allowed part of that liberty and freedom to attack the people who believe so. So you're allowed to say, I don't believe in communion anymore, I don't believe in the church anymore, but you're not allowed to say you are idiots because you go to the church. So this is the fine line between having a space for you to say whatever you want, but without attacking other people, using the same flag that we gave you part of the freedom. So you cannot say, I'm an ex-Muslim, but all the Muslims are X and Y because you're like, I don't know how they believe in. You have all the liberty to say, I don't want to believe in Islam anymore, but you don't have a liberty to diss all the people who believe in that. So it's the difference. Like, I don't believe in Ramadan. I don't like how we fast, but it's not the same as saying, I don't know how these silly people, sorry to say that, like, how do they do Ramadan? So this is it. But it's so difficult getting people there, because what I think, and this is, I think it's going to be part of my master thesis this time, it's how do you change a culture that does not respect dialogue, that rejects the other just because they are different in opinion. Like, we could be all Palestinians, we could be all Muslims, but we will be very different in thinking politically. It's like, it's the rejection of the other, and it's the difficult part where you're either, and I think it's connected to the monotheistic religions in general. It's like a one-man show. It's a standalone module. It's a one thing that you're either with us or against us, or I cannot accept all these kind of different colors of a rainbow because we should all be purple. And I think this is the problem. It's about the education, how we are taught to think from one side, and even the fake history they taught us, the fake point of views of the world. We grew up with so many distorted views of the world and how we view it, because we were taught from one way, because we were not taught to look around and analyze and think on our own somehow. I don't know if that makes sense.
That definitely makes sense, but I would challenge that. I would just challenge the question a little bit of how can we change the culture into becoming more respecting of the other. And I think for me, I'm very interested in politics. So religion in itself, you know, not the message, the institution is a political project. Historically speaking, every religion that exists in the world has an institution that's a political project. And so with that politicization of it, you know, we start internalizing an identity politics that's very much interjected with religion. And that's why I agree with you, Laila, when you said that the Islamic culture, Arab culture are like pretty much like intertwined. So it's hard to kind of distinguish. But at the same time, like, I feel like that saying that, you know, the Arab culture, for example, or the Arab world, we need to change the culture so that it's more respecting of dialogue. It insinuates that as people there's an inability of that, or as it assumes that we do not have it. And I think it's not that the culture doesn't have it. I think that it's the politics that internalizes the fact that I need to protect what I have, because if I don't, then I lose. I mean, if we think about the spread of the Islamic culture, and I'm using quotations on purpose, we will realize that it's always been a political fight. Starting from the different sects of Islam, the same thing in Christianity, the same thing in Judaism, and other religions. So, at least in the context of contemporary history, when with what happened in the Iranian Revolution of Khomeini, that's the only reason the Islamic culture, if you may, spread in the so-called Arab world, in the Middle East, to create that political divide. Who is pro Iran, who is pro Saudi Arabia? And that's how we became who we are. We internalized an identity that said, I am a Sunni Muslim, and therefore that's a political statement. And by just saying that I'm Sunni Muslim, I am and rejecting the Shia rhetoric, and even engaging in a discussion with somebody Shia, just claiming that you're just wrong. I'm just engaging in a political fight that's and rivalry that has existed since forever. And so, but this, you know, saying no to discussion is just a political stand, rather than a cultural, I guess just the culture argument of just a cultural inability. I think it's just a political reason that causes the culture to protect in order not to have outside influencers. And I think that also draws from what Khawla said earlier about colonialism, just fear of incoming ideas of, they call it in Arabic غزو ثقافي, like they don't want that, and there's just so much fear that would happen. So like, okay, we're not going to engage because we're just too afraid that our norms will change.
I agree with you, Shatha, like completely. It's really it brings me back to the even the composition of identity and even how identity forms. But here also just to challenge even the how we define culture. So culture is not something that is what is being said, but also what is being inherited from this collective memory and collective buildup of the society where we lived in, because it makes all the difference in building these kind of construct of how we believe in that. But I agree on that point. I forgot important. I wanted to say something different, but I got caught up because I was looking through that. And I have a striking example. It's not about that people's culture is difficult, but it's how they behave, because the political side is so important, what you said, because it's all about politics in the end. It's how the political institutions, even in religion, and maybe especially in religion. But it really strikes you how this is different in their understanding. Like, for example, I have a very striking example where it hits me. It's like, even if you talk about coronavirus now and social distancing, like people are sitting here. The Palestinian government has forced a lockdown since the 5th of March. People have been staying home. You're not supposed to go out. You need to wear masks, etc., etc. And then when it started to open up, please use social distancing. Please stay away from each other. And the first minute we went out, everybody was stuck to each other. It's like, and it's really crazy. But the problem is, the same people would go, for example, to Jerusalem, where it's occupied by the Israelis and it's under the Israeli authorities. They stay away from each other. And the question is why? Why the same people? It's like in the same place, not different time, same time. And it goes again for like the people the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. So they live under the Israeli jurisdiction as the state of Israel. And then they go past to Ramallah, which is under the Palestinian Authority. There's, I don't know, it's less authority of police, etc. It's like they follow the rules, the traffic rules so eloquently in Jerusalem. Like they stop, they do everything. The minute they go into Ramallah, they break every traffic rule. And the question is, what is about their mentality that changes? What is the different settings? What is the different political, and it's really crazy because they're the same people.
I have an answer.
And they look at it, it's like people who, and I'm sure, and I said that, I challenged some people like yesterday about that. It's like, I bet you the same people who are breaking the social distancing rules in a supermarket here in Ramallah, the minute they go into a different country, they would respect the rules there. And the question is, it's not about, it's like, what is it about? What is the answer for this kind of question?
So according to my research, because I do political science research, there's empirical evidence that institutions shape behavior. So if there's a strong institution, your behavior will be shaped. So the example of that, you know, like they say, there's this sentiment in Libya that says, oh, you know, Americans and Europeans just respect the law. They're just respectful people. We are not. Like, Libyans are just like chaotic. And so what we saw in what was it, Minneapolis? Yeah, Minneapolis, following George Floyd's death by the police. The people of Minneapolis went crazy, like the riots and stores are broken into, tires are being burned. There's just fire. The city there's chaos, and I love to use that example because, well, here the same people, the Americans, behaved the exact same way the Libyans did when the institution lost its respect, its legitimacy. So in the U.S., the police, which is part of the institution, they lost their legitimacy after the death of George Floyd, at least in Minneapolis. So then people were like, okay, we're not going to respect the institution. So they went, in France, people respected the lockdown laws because there's a fine. You're going to have to pay so much money to go out, and nobody wants to pay money. In Libya, they said lockdown, but there was no fine. So, and even if you get fined, there's a lot of corruption. So you may not actually have to pay it. So there's institutions play a significant role and significant. They really shape behavior. And so I don't think that it's just that that certain humans, certain individuals are more inclined to respect. And that's why I think you're right. When you go to a place that has laws, they're respected and follow it. And then when you go to a place, as you said, like the cross to Ramallah, automatically they break these same laws.
Yeah. So I was saying that I'm still thinking about what you said, right? That you have a hard time distinguishing between Islamic religion and or culture, or like it wouldn't be Islamic culture, but it would be
Mhm.
Oh my God. Okay, let me start again. So if I understood you correctly, you said that you have a hard time distinguishing between the parts of your identity that are influenced by Arab culture, right? And then even so you're Christian by the religion of Islam, right?
Like, I think, yeah, because I
Is
define
it
part of my culture as part of the Islamic culture I live in.
exactly? Exactly. And you're not the first Christian Arab that I hear say that, right? But it always makes me wonder because, like, I as a German Muslim, I see the difference between my Islamic faith and my German culture. Like, it couldn't be more obvious. It's like so clear to me, right?
I have a, yeah,
So this like I don't know. It just
I have an answer for you.
yeah. Tell me.
It's two things. First of all, well, like three things. First of all, because education, because my education entailed a lot of Muslim culture and past Muslim history and heritage, because this is what we learn at school mainly. So this is part of it. The second part of it, which is I actually live in a Muslim majority culture, so this is part of my majority of my life. So my faith and religion is something separate. I do as a Christian in my own life, but in my mainstream life, I live in a more of a Muslim culture where the majority are Muslims. And the third thing, it has to do with politics, because as a Palestinian, usually for me, it's negative discrimination against me. So the Israelis sometimes they try to divide us. So they try to treat me differently because I'm a Palestinian Christian rather than a Palestinian in general. So I tend to this bigger umbrella where I identify as a Palestinian with the Muslim culture I live in, because they want us to be divided to say that the problem are because Muslims are bad, we're fighting Muslims, they are against Israel, etc., etc. So it's that also political side of it. So it's multifaceted where I see myself. Uh, First of all, I feel I belong there, and the second one, I have other reasons to feel the need to be part of that bigger end. But what you're saying is, you and Shatha has reminded me of Norbert Elias. I don't know if you heard of him. And then also what Foucault was saying about that. It's about discipline or institutions or how you force into that. So the control of society is like, nobody can see me, but I stop because there's a red light, because I know if I cross it, I'm breaking the law, etc. So it's that kind of mentality where it's so mixed up, because in a Palestinian context, I need to respect the law there. So there is a part of the law, but at the same time, I should be breaking a lot of other stuff because I'm fighting occupation. So we have this mix and struggle of doing that. And it's like, because I know in Jerusalem I will be double fined, I will be looked at differently because I'm a Palestinian, like I'm not a non-Jewish like citizen of Jerusalem. So I will be discriminated against. I'll probably take the fine, where some people could be dismissed because they're Jewish. And we see that on the roads, because there are joint roads where we are discriminated against because we're Palestinians, because they can fine us, and they do in a higher amount. And the second part is that I would disagree about the discipline, and it's also about, like, for me it's both. Like, I believe in where institutions could enforce this kind of culture, but at the same time it's also, I feel it's ingrained also in the way you are brought up and the way you are learning to do that. So you can be in a violent culture, for example, like in a violent upbringing where you are like yelled at, or you are always seeing people hitting other people, so you are brought up into that. Or it's like it's two different things for me. It's like two sets of things, but I believe that it's also ingrained in how you are brought up, despite the institution that would do that. Because I would agree and disagree on both ends. Like, I would agree on some laws or some enforcement of laws to make things right, but at the same time I wouldn't agree on disciplining people using force or using the kind of control that even mentally controls you. Because sometimes for me, occupation is mental more than something physical I see only. And at the same time, I believe it's a culture that, you know, like you are brought up to that.
I'm really sorry to hear that, Laila. I think in the 21st century, it's just unbelievable that there is what is it is what it is. It is essentially apartheid. It is what it is, you know, and it's just absolutely disgraceful that you have to go through that. I think I'm really sorry to hear that. Yeah, and I think kudos to you as well for not allowing the oppression that you face to internalize your anger, and because you mentioned that some people can make it about how Arab Palestinians are towards Christian and you're not letting that division affect you. So kudos. I wanted to touch up on something Shatha mentioned about Minneapolis, and it links in with my point. And I want to invite Ziria to respond to this. It links into my point about Ayan Hirsi Ali, right? So I think another issue that we need to talk about when we talk about gender, culture, and religion in the globalized world is also capitalism, right? And I think the situation right now encourages. So, for example, the reason I shared this screen is because I've been scrolling through this timeline, and Katie Hopkins is making a valid point, right? So she's talking about the looters and whatnot that's happening right now as a result of this George Floyd dying because of police brutality. However, she's not talking at all about the fact that a black man was basically murdered for no good reason. Well, you can't murder anyone for good reason anyway, but he was murdered and the person wasn't held accountable for it. So yes, you're making a good point, but your language is irresponsible. And this is precisely what I'm trying to say about Ayan Hirsi Ali. She makes valid points. Her suffering is valid. I'm not denying her experience, but she needs to understand that with her platform, and I'll bring capitalism into this now, with her platform, there is a certain responsibility about the way you communicate your language, because you can inadvertently oppress other people, which is precisely the thing that you're campaigning against. Right? Now, where does capitalism fit into this? We now live in a culture, in a society that's about sound bites. Twitter is 140 characters. The more provocative you are, the more likely you are to get airtime on BBC and ITV. If you're an Anjem Chowdhury, you get invited to talk. If you're a Dr. Jennifer Eggert, you have to jump through more hoops to get onto a Newsnight. Same with myself, same with Laila, anyone on this chat. Controversy gives you exposure. Now, people are prepared to basically, I'm sorry to use explicit language, but to prostitute their views in order to get exposure. So now, Katie Hopkins is thinking about relevancy. She's come out of bankruptcy. She wants exposure, but her views are subjugating and oppressing Black people because it's distracting from the conversation. This is completely a byproduct of capitalism and our continuous desire to try to get attention for our views, and we forget actually what our initial objective was.
But connecting to that, Osama, you need to ask yourself, where is she coming from? Why is she writing the way she is? Why do they write about the chaos of people under oppression or under inequality rather than talking about the man who died, who was brutally killed? And this is the main question. Why do they write this in that way? Because they want to portray something they see. And this is where we go into like supremacy, like white supremacy, and also the view of like you're seeing all these people, and it's like the same composition when you talk about that, when you put people in a lesser class, when you oppress them, when they're poor, when you don't give them the same equality, they react or they do whatever they do, and then you look like, oh, look at them, they cannot. And this is a striking examples of us Palestinians at the same time. Like they took our land, they made us work for less, they're stopping us in our roads, and then they say, oh, look at these violent people, they're throwing a rock at our jeeps that are inside their towns, that are stopping them from living, that have killed a young man just 5 minutes ago. And this is it, this is where they stand, this is where they come from, because they come from that place where they look at other people, how they fail to go to their own built-up standard.
Gender comes in it as well, right? Because they have very specific ways in which they speak about men. and they have very specific ways in which they speak about women, right? So the women, they tend to be oppressed. The men are violent and extremist.
Sorry to interrupt, but they also they have been using it also in reverse. Women are used to be suicide bombers or recruits. They're being used for men to fight. Women are being used to do this and to do that. They're also used in this kind of context as well, in that other sense.
Absolutely. No, I was actually speaking about it with a colleague today. And we were speaking in the about Muslim women, right? But there's very similar narratives about Arab women. And it was basically that the dominant narratives when speaking about Muslim women is that they're either extremists or they're oppressed, right? And it's like, I mean, it's such a contradiction, right? Because like, how can you be both at the same time, right? How can you be both extremists and have agency and then be oppressed and not have any? And I think,
go on.
I think that's one of the ways where they actually make it really easy for us to challenge these kind of stereotypes, because if they're so contradictory, right? Because it's pretty easy, even for someone who is not on board with a lot of the bigger analysis around all of this, it's very easy to point out these very basic contradictions to them, right? And be like, hey, I mean, either I take your job as an immigrant, or I take your benefits, right? Which are both dominant narratives about immigrants in this country, at least. But how can I be doing both at the same time? Doesn't make any sense.
But that rhetoric also exists within the community of believers. It's there's like that's some sort of a zero-sum game. Either you're Muslim or you're not. So somebody like me, whenever somebody looks at me, they're like, are you sure you're Muslim? Like, you know.
You don't look Muslim. Yeah,
I don't look Muslim. I don't talk Muslim.
You don't sound Muslim.
Nothing about me screams Islam. And so there's that I guess people love to how do you say, compartmentalize.
Your intellect does.
They love binaries, right? It's also, you have this in a lot of Muslim communities, and again, like for me, this would be how people practice this, right? It would be culture, it would be practices rather than theology. But you have this this narrative of a good woman and a bad woman, right? And then they have these very simplified identifiers of good Muslim woman. She wears a headscarf, and she is a bit socially awkward, right? Doesn't really look at people, doesn't really talk. And then on the other hand, you have the bad woman, right?
Or a good wife and a bad wife.
Yeah, or someone who is acceptable wife material and someone who is not, right? So I think people, they just like these binaries.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering about the question that Sean is asking. It's just not very clear for me. Osama, can you elaborate on that?
I think he believes that some Western commentators acknowledge that patriarchy exists in the West as well as in the Middle East. However, their opinion can be that patriarchy in the West was built and layered upon an Arab patriarchy. So there is a chronology of where patriarchy exists and when it begins, and that it started in the Arab world, according to
began with men, it ends with men everywhere, every culture.
Exactly. I'm of the same view. Exactly. I assume everyone here is of the same view. So
it's been an automatic reply for me.
I agree and disagree at the same time. I think that patriarchy is started with both men and, started with men, perpetuated by both men and women. But like to answer John's question, whether patriarchy came from the Arab world, I mean, the origin of patriarchy, I mean, I don't know if we can pinpoint an origin of patriarchy, but like the travelers who went to the Middle East in the past, they wrote back and talked about how extremely sexual the culture is and how people express their sexuality very freely. I mean, like historically speaking, in the history of the Middle East, the Arab world, and that the whole region in general. I mean, people were homosexuality was part of was a normal part of the culture. It was considered the norm. that in fact, actually, like having an all. I remember I read this book in my dad's library that said that there was that a man having sexual relationship with another man is for social status, while marriage with a woman was just a mere for reproduction only. So there is, in terms of sexuality, I think, and actually, the Middle East was a lot more free than the West. So that's why travelers used to come to the Middle East, and that's why they made all these Orientalists picked images and poetry and ideas, you know, from how their travels. Like, oh, you can go to the Middle East and enjoy being, you know, around people who express their sexuality extremely free. So I would challenge that view, and I think that the commentators from the West, if they make that such comment, it's just an Orientalist. It's just an Orientalist frame that they use that they use to make statements about the Middle East and nothing else.
I agree with Shatha. I would add to that also another component of it's like I don't think there was a point in history where it all started there. They started exploring the Middle East, but historically, like thousands of years ago in their civilization, and even before that, patriarchy existed there. And when they moved, they observed how patriarchy looked like somewhere else, for example, but that did not mean that it originated there. Like even not only the Middle East, even Asia, when they went throughout and away to India and other places, it's where they it was very Eurocentric observations. It's like not only Orientalist but also towards the other parts of the world. So I believe it's for me it's a Eurocentric view of pinpointing where patriarchy started, because from history and for all the observations and the track records of all other places, it started so many places. So you cannot pinpoint it.
So yeah, it's interesting that we refer to Orientalist travelers as travelers. It's the same way. It's the same thing with the whole expats thing, and I don't know. It's interesting how we change our language according to if the individual traveling and observing was white or not. If he was white, he's a traveler. But I think a lot of these Orientalists were immigrants. They were there for a long time. They were there for months on end.
But the question is, if you want to ask about these Western travelers, most of them are men, actually, if not all of them. And this also brings it in. Why did women why did men travel? Why did men explore? Why did men invade? Because it came from that end. Women were not allowed to go into boats, where being in the sea was the most thing that states or nations or empires did. The women were not allowed to be there. And this is where it originates as well. It's also, when looking at it, it's objectifying patriarchy in a place that is not us, because we are civilized. We got past that. We got past religion. We got past these things. These are not ingrained in our culture. Our civilization culture is where we want people to go to. I forgot the term that we use for that. It's like to modernize, like modernization. What is modernization? It's like you need to become like us, because we grew up, we went through that. What is patriarchy? It originated at your end. It's like, no, it's still ingrained in your culture as well, in your places, and this is where it started, and this is where it starts. Like I can't remember if it's, I remember when we were in the UK, when they said about being judges, a professor went into the room of students, and they had international students, and one of them was Indian. He was our friend. He said, like, in order to be a judge, you need to be over 60, you need to be white, you need to be a man, and he excluded 90% of the people in the room. And it's all about that. It's like it's that kind of language that is exposed or that is reflected into the Middle East, not only the Orientalists, but also the modernization. And this is why we have it, and it became part of our culture. Oh, look at the Europeans, they're better than us, because we conditioned ourselves to say that modernization or becoming better is becoming like Europeans, like to give up this and this and that, because we had all the stuff. Oh, we are, and this is where we came. People like Arabs started disbelieving in themselves, like, oh, we're Arabs, we're chaotic, we don't know how to do this, we don't know how to do that. But then in fact, that's not true. But we are used to say that in kind of a joke, but it became ingrained in our thinking that we are chaotic, we don't deserve that, we don't have democracy, we haven't done that, and it goes back into our civilizations, and we need to be modernized as such and such.
Evening, everyone. Would it be okay if I interjected, ask quickly?
Please
Can you hear
do.
me?
Yes.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm just forgive the bike helmet. I stopped in the park and I made time for. I was really enjoying the discussion, and I've been listening pretty much the whole time. I just wanted to interrupt my cycle to quickly ask this. I want to clarify the question you asked on my behalf earlier, because I think it wasn't clear. I wasn't saying necessarily, Oz, that there was a patriarchy in the Arab world that preceded Western patriarchy, because everyone said right at the beginning of the conversation, yet they acknowledged that there are different forms of patriarchy across almost all cultures, right? If people agree on that, do they think what makes it worse, the arrival of Western patriarchy, was it because it was kind of layered on top of previous or other patriarchies, or is it just that it's qualitatively kind of worse than these other forms, or it kind of largely replaced them? Or, I don't know. I just wanted a clarification on that point, because I thought that was quite an interesting thing mentioned quite early on in the discussion, and I didn't want it to move too far past that before I got my answer.
I would love Shatha to reply to that, because that goes back to where she was in a place where they said Libya needed more feminism. It's bringing a new fake kind of breaking the patriarchy, but with another set of non-Arab patriarchies, like, oh, be like Europe and stop this patriarchy, where there are also other layers of patriarchy there. Or that's not breaking the patriarchy for us. It's like for us, it's like saying, oh, you need to stop have freedom to wear shorts, or to have cut, or to wear whatever you want. But is it what we want? Is this what breaking patriarchy, bringing or taking women somewhere else where this is not their choice, just because it's somebody else's and it breaks what exists in their culture? And that's not exactly the case. For me, it brings something challenging as well, because it brings a more challenge to people rejecting that because it's European. At the same time, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, but it's like replacing something with something else. It's replacing one set of, like, one part of patriarchy into something different, or another one. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, it makes it more complicated, because it adds another layer we have to struggle with in order to define what is breaking patriarchy for us.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks for that answer.
I would also argue again the politicization of patriarchy. There's a very important political aspect to this. So, for example, if I speak about if I practice my feminism in the context of my culture, the Libyan culture, I would be what's the word? I would be challenged, because I live in the United States. So my feminism and whatever I would advocate for would be, oh, this is just an Americanization of thought. You're just trying to bring American thought into our culture. We don't need that. If that makes sense. So I think because of colonialism, at least in the context of Libya, there is fear that ideas that come from the West, disguised in liberation and feminism, that they're just there to exist in order for the Libyan value system and the Libyan culture to be destroyed. So it's just a fight against our heritage. So that's why you see at least from the context of the Libyan culture, it's fought and it's rejected. However, it's important to understand patriarchy in context. So saying that fighting the patriarchy in the United States is completely different than fighting the patriarchy in Saudi Arabia, is absolutely different than fighting patriarchy in Bosnia. It's just Bosnia, Saudi Arabia, and North Africa and Palestine have large Muslim populations. But the patriarchy that needs to be fought in all of these regions of the world cannot be a Western patriarchy. It just needs to be a contextualized fight against patriarchy.
Yeah, that's good. I agree.
Shatha, what do you mean by the politicization of gender issues? What do you want to elaborate on that?
What I mean with it is that, so I think there are just so many structures, institutional structures that exist that in return we end up internalizing into our identities. So we have I'll speak about myself. So I was born in Tripoli into a Muslim family, into a Libyan family. So I became Arab, Libyan, Muslim, and woman without me choosing it. Like I didn't choose any of these things. I just became those things. And then I grew up to become that. So I internalized that identity. And by just these four things, if we're talking about me being a woman, I was decided, my gender has been decided for me at birth, even though we know that's not true. But socially, I was constructed to have a particular gender and to move and fulfill that gender role that I expected to fulfill. So that is the political institution of gender dynamics. Then we have the political institution of religion. So by default, I was born in Libya. By default, I became Sunni. I became transcribed to that, to all of that, to all of the institutions and the history of Islamic, the Sunni Islam. And then by being born in Tripoli, I automatically become an urban North African by the Mediterranean individual. And what was that fourth thing that I said? I forgot. Was Libyan. And then Arab, right? Arab and North African. So if I do my ancestor, I have no idea what my ancestors are from. I'm Libyan and I call myself Arab and I call myself North African, but I'm not a Maziri. My last name is not Arab. It's not an Arabic last name. And so, but all of these things are just institutions that exist in order to create a political movement. It's like nationalism, right? I need to create, in order for me to keep the population within these borders to be all intact and in mobilize them, I need to make these identity politics extremely strong. And that the only way to do that is to create strong political institutions, and not institutions in the sense that they are physical institutions, but these are abstract institutions, if you may. I don't think I'm using the right word here, but it's like what Laila said earlier. It's the occupation of the mind, and it's if I want to continue to belong to the Libyan society, and if I want to continue to connect to the Libyan society, I need to be careful what I say and what I don't say, what I end up showing and what I don't end up showing. And that's what I mean with the politicization of patriarchy. That there's so many spaces that require navigation and going back and forth, and the things that transcend some of these boundaries, and things that you just have to navigate the spaces on their own. I don't know if any of what I said makes sense. I feel, I don't know. I'm not sure.
I would love to reply, but after Victoria introduces herself, I would like to reply and give another example from here with the same thought.
Well, my name is Victoria Silva. I'm a freelance journalist based in Jordan, because I am from Spain, and I have been several years already working from here, covering different issues of Middle East news and, well, many kind of different of things. And I have been for some time following you, but I don't know why sometimes it's not very good schedule for me, so I have not joined any conversation until now. But now I say, okay, well, let's join today to see what is the topic you are discussing and see how. So, that's something.
That's a very humble introduction, Victoria. Given your qualifications on this subject.
No, I don't have any qualification in gender. My only qualification is being a woman and a human being. I guess not an expert in anything at all. So I would like to hear more about what you are discussing, and then maybe I can, I don't know, say anything.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Hussam Eddin. I have just earned my master's with distinction in diplomacy and religion from Lancaster in the UK. And I'm a graduate of Al-Azhar University from the Faculty of Sharia and Law from the English department. I currently work as a member of Al-Azhar Fatwa Global Center, and also I'm currently working as a lecturer at Al-Azhar University at the Faculty of Sharia and Law, or the law school at Al-Azhar University. And I have known Osama for quite long now, and it has been always productive. I'm not sure if I have met Dr. Laila before, but yeah, because Osama mentioned that also you were involved with the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. But really, this is very interesting, and I really appreciate all the discussion. I'm so sorry I was not able to join earlier, but I have seen the question of Osama speaking of the issue of gender. I have always been very interested on all of these issues, and even when I was doing my master's at the University of Lancaster, I was always keen to attend all of even the modules that were not part of my degree to have all the perspectives on this issue. One core issue is the definition of what is exactly gender, and this is something that we can see clearly in many things. Like even when Shatha spoke about many social constructs, this also applies to gender. So we don't have a clear definition of what gender is. So this is an issue that also we need to look into, what is meant exactly by gender, and especially given many social developments, be it with regard to the LGBTQ and then plus movement and the social ramifications for this, and many aspects. So I don't want to to embark on all of this now. Another issue is, if you are going to speak about Islam, yeah, the Muslim scholars spoke about this. They clearly state that men and women, they are equal, but they are not identical, and we can elaborate on this. So it's a matter of justice, not just a matter of identical, because by the end of the day, but when it comes to rights and obligations, Islam's stance is very clear that yes, both of them are equal, and given the responsibilities of each one, Islam deals with all of this. So it needs to be a holistic approach if we really want to discern the stance of Islam in all of this. It was really interesting to listen to all the views that I have just witnessed. But also I'd like to bring to the discussion the concept of self-imposed colonialism, which is not much spoken about when it comes to many of the realms of the social sciences. And the point that I'd like to conclude with, I did a module on the study of religion, and I wrote a paper, and the paper that I wrote was on the question of to what extent the category religion describes what Islam is. And I'd love to share with you more about the findings, but even with the category of analysis like religion, there has been so much critique, like Timothy Fitzgerald, Dalal Assad, Richard King, and the ideology of religious studies. So this is the point. Like I was speaking of the issue of modernity, also what is its essence, which is not an issue or a matter of agreement. So all of these are things like when we approach them systematically, I think we can then reach clear answers and clear conclusions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please share the. I mean, I don't know if everybody is.
Yes, please.
I want to know the results of the paper.
I mean, on terms of the category religion and Islam.
Yeah.
In principle, also very briefly, there is so much critique to the category religion, so much so, or to the extent that you find some experts or some scholars they say that we need to do away with the category religion, and like instead use a category like culture, for example, and the need for restructuring all even departments of studies. If I elaborate more, another point is the etymology of the word religion and its Latin word coming from the term religio and coming from a source of obligation, and how after all of this the category religion evolved to become the binary opposite of the secular, and what this means in the Western mind, or in the Western experience, which is totally different from the experience of the Muslim mind and the Muslim hemisphere, if I may put it this way. So there is so much critique, and like even Shahab Ahmad in What is Islam, Talal Asad in more than one work of him or of his, and my own conclusion and the point that I supported in the paper. Alhamdulillah, I got a distinction also in this paper. So if we need to do justice to understanding a particular religious phenomenon, we need to define it in its own terms. Otherwise, it will be blurry, and we will not end up doing justice to understanding the phenomena at hand. Very briefly. And thanks for your question.
That's cool. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hussam and Shatha. I want to, like the way you talked about that. I'm sorry, Hussam, because I was in a different program. I didn't have the privilege to meet you and the Azhar project team because I was in a different project. I wish we could have met.
Alhamdulillah, still we have the
Yes, of course, inshallah. But listening to you talk and listening to Shatha talk, and I think I'd like to bring in an example that strikes me as such of all the things that you have been saying. So, for example, the agreement of Sidao, that was brought in. So, politically speaking, it's a humanitarian. For me, it's a humanitarian declaration where we try to we institutionalize something to force people to respect women's rights and try to make it, to establish it, and to be well respected. But the way it is politically viewed and the way it could be twisted, it could be taken in so many different ways in a very wrong way. So, for example, for us, like as an Arab, as with the Muslim culture, with the Christian religion, I believe that we do respect women and we do fight for their rights, regardless of what some people could do or could use religion to do that, whether Christian or Muslim. So politically, it became a tool. So it's a political tool as well to manipulate states, for example. So Palestine, to prove its good intention that they recognize human rights and women's rights, etc., they signed the agreement without reservations. So this created also another layer of problem because they wanted to say to the world, we are, as you think you want us to be, we are a state which respects rights, and we want to acknowledge and to enter as many agreements as we want, and then we endorse CEDAW as an agreement, and they did not do any reservations. So that in principle came in and then started to become in effect. In another realm where there are some movements which are rejecting the way the Palestinian Authority is dealing with religion and the way of Sharia and all the other stuff. And there are people who are playing with that concept, and there's the culture of that and how they streamlined it into people. So when they wanted to put this into effect, the people of Hizb ut-Tahrir and other extremists, they pushed the people and streamlined them to say the PA wants to impose something that is against Islam, which is not necessarily true when it comes to CEDAW. Because A, from a technical view, the agreement says that you can make reservations, and B, the things that are said that the Hizb ut-Tahrir and the extremist people used against the CEDAW agreement was not true in relation to how Islam views the rights of women and girls in regards to how the agreement also portrays it. And when the president also signed the agreement or endorsed it, he said that it should not contradict the general law of Palestine, which includes the Islamic Sharia. So it became a political tool where people started to use gender and defending women's rights in their own way, and then also taking Islam out of context and saying that this is against Islam, and then there became the fight. And then the universal fight became that, oh, Islam is against women, but Islam is not against women. But okay, CEDAW is against Islam. CEDAW is not against Islam. So the PA is against Muslim people, and it wants to modernize or to de-Islam Palestine in that term. So it became that fight because all people from their own parties, politically and religion-wise, but then the people who take religion out of context or the practice or their. So that became the issue, and now we have a huge fight where people started fighting civil society even they started attacking CBOs and NGOs who work with women's rights and saying they are with Sidaw, they are against Islam, so you need to stop listening to them. So it's also mainstreaming all these views as Islam, where they're not. So it's a kind of, and I think this brings in what Shatha was saying about all this political institutionalization and the use of that kind of stuff in a different culture where it becomes a conflict, because the Palestinian Authority wants to defend itself, the international declaration, and then the people, and then the religion and the communities. And this became a huge, actually it's still a huge debate, but it brought up so much chaos where somehow there were people who were ready to protest and go into the streets until it was, well, controlled. I don't want to say how, but Osama, go ahead.
Can I ask, there's a reason I mentioned the hijab, which I'll elaborate on in a second, but do Palestinian Christians, are there Palestinian Christians that that cover their head? Does it exist?
In church, yes, we are requested to do that in church. We don't actually do. Some people enforce it, but some don't.
Yeah.
But I would say the other way, there are some Muslims who do not wear scarf, and this is also common in Palestine. So we have that kind of, like we have a part of a continuum in Palestine as any other society, but it's totally different. Like we have more of social liberty somehow than other Arab countries. Despite the fact that people could look otherwise because we are an occupied country, but we have a bit of a space, and I think sometimes it could be relating to occupation, because occupation has done some good push for Palestinian women at some point, because it brought them to the front lines. Because it brought us to the front lines of fighting, which can be negatively used but positively used mostly. Because during the intifadas, during the fights, women were also in the front lines. They were partners in the resistance. They were partners when they protected the families, when they brought up the children, when they helped the wounded, when they took part into the intellectual ones, and they were also they were fighters. They were soldiers as well. So the resistance against the occupation, let's say, not the occupation itself, helped women, Palestinian women, rise up and become a more dependent part of the community as such. And there's a huge women movement in Palestine that has, I mean, we still have our challenges. We're still having our basic challenges, let's say, in an Arab world, but still we have gone a bit further at some point, but still not in all places, because we still have child marriages. We still have so much violence against women in Palestine in massive numbers.
I just want to mention, the reason I mentioned hijab was because we did a poll for our, and I want to hear, even though Zuriab is not a woman, obviously, I still want to hear his opinion on this, perhaps Victoria's as well. So we polled our audience, we asked them these questions. So these are the attitudes of Arabs that live inside and outside the Arab world. So we asked them if they think that hijab can be an expression of feminism, not is it a blanket expression? Because obviously hijab can be used to oppress and it can be used to liberate. It depends how you're doing it, right? And 93% said yes, it can be it is possible for hijab to be an expression of feminism. So there was a unanimity there. And then there was another gender-related issue we asked about, which is, do you prefer to marry a partner from your native country over an Arab or non-Arab in the West? And only 31% said that they prefer that. But we did some analysis on this, and we think that this could be because a lot of our Arab audience live outside the Arab world. Yes.
But I like some of the questions. I need to take part in your polls and analysis.
Yes, we asked quite a few. But I wanted to, when do you think that covering, at what context, if you wanted to, imagine that we're talking to someone that has no understanding of hijab or Islam or gender issues in Islam, and they were completely ignorant on their perspective, and they had the what is now the default position that if you wear the hijab, you're repressed. If you had the opportunity to clarify to them how hijab can liberate an individual, and when it can, and the certain context where applying a hijab can become oppressive, how would you clarify that to an individual? Like, yeah.
Can I ask you a reverse question before I let the floor to people? When did wearing a scarf became a sign of oppression to begin with?
What
Like
do you
when so my main question would be when wearing a hijab or something that is related to a cult or a culture or a behavior became a sign of oppression. Who said that? It's like how? Why do you think? Like when did hijab even became an issue? When did hijab became or wearing a scarf or covering your hair became an issue? Why wasn't it about why wearing shorts became an issue, which became an issue actually? Do you remember a story? Like I remember there's the whole story of measuring women's bikini and how long they were. They should have been on a Western beach. But so the question, I think the origin becomes when did hijab or wearing a scarf became an issue or a sign of oppression? And this is where the conversation could start. Why did it even became that kind of issue to begin with?
I have an
Then I would have my
instinctive
opinion.
answer. I have an instinctive answer, but I want to hear if you have an opinion on this first before I express it.
I don't know. I don't want to talk. I talk too much. I want to hear the girls. But yes, I agree that wearing hijab can be an expression of feminism.
Does anyone else have an opinion on this before I express myself?
I wrote a paper on this, on covering your hair or covering in general, the veiling. I have my personal opinion about it, but I agree that it can be an expression of feminism and it can be a source of oppression. I think about the veil in the context of not just the physical covering of the hair or the body. I think about it more in terms of the occupation of space. Would the veil, would the physical veil marginalize you or push you toward the edge and occupy less public space, or will you still be able to occupy public spaces? So for me, it's just that the veil has to do so much with my ability or inability to be present in public spheres and public spaces rather than be pushed in private spaces. So I think that would probably that relates to the idea of if it being oppressive or if it being liberating. If I am able to express myself whether I'm wearing it or not, and I have my voice loud wherever I go, then the physical manifestation of a veil does not exist. But like, for example, where I grew up, girls don't wear hijab. I mean, we have some who do, but it's not, at least in the younger generation don't wear it. My grandma, I think, only wore it when she was in her 70s or something. So I guess, but what we were told culturally or from a religious perspective, I don't know, that there's a thing صوت المرأة عورة, which what would that be?
The voice of a woman is to be treated like a private part.
Yeah, so that to me, that translates into a veil that's not just a veil you put on your head, but that's just a way of you being pushed to a private space and be marginalized and occupy less public space. So that's when the veil, whether physical covering or whatever type of covering it is, if it's veiling you from occupying public space, from speaking loudly, and from being heard, then that is when it becomes problematic. Otherwise, I mean, you wear whatever you want to wear. You want to put a hijab on, you want to wear shorts, whatever you want to wear, you should be able to wear.
I feel that this comparative approach can be quite helpful when it comes to these kind of questions, right? A headscarf can be a lot of things, right? It can be a symbol for oppression, it can be a symbol for liberation, it can be a religious symbol, it can be a cultural symbol, it can be an identifier for class, right? You have countries where it's only poor women or rural women will wear headscarf, whereas more educated and urban women won't. or vice versa, right? The other way around. So it can be an awful lot of things. Context, again, is really, really, really important in this, when it comes to this question. When it comes to dealing with people who ask these sort of questions that you mentioned at the very beginning, Osama, right? I find what really, really helps is to take this comparative perspective, right? And to say, look, a headscarf can be a lot of things, right? But so can a miniskirt, right? A miniskirt can be
Exactly.
symbol. It can be a symbol for liberation, and for some women, it has historically and still is today a symbol for liberation, whereas for others it's a symbol for sexual exploitation, right?
Exactly.
So it can be anything and everything, and it really just depends on the context. Yeah, in the end, I mean, I so agree with what Shatha just said. And again, this is something I would say to these people: it's about choice. It's never about a piece of clothing. It's never about a symbol, right? I mean, nothing can be just one symbol that stands for one thing, because it all depends on context. Right? I still remember, like, when I was doing my field research in Lebanon, and then I had one of my favorite dresses is like a long black dress, and I loved this dress, and it was just so comfortable to wear, and it was the most practical. But I wore this in Lebanon, and they all thought I was super conservative, because over there they see this as an abaya. They don't see this as a long dress. It's an abaya, and it means you are conservative. That's it. And I was in a conservative corner, and I could do whatever else I wanted. I could wear like my pink hijabs. I could wear my rainbow color hijabs. I was in the conservative corner, and end of question, right? But it's like a very contextual thing. Like it wouldn't be read in the same way. I don't know, in Birmingham or in London or in Paris or in Frankfurt.
I agree.
Can I?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, just before you say, Sama, for me, for this context, for me, hijab is politics, because hijab was politicized, and this is the case for me. It stopped becoming a choice or a sign of oppression in a religion or not. Because like for us, covering your head and scarf is something that has become very. It was like in religion and in church, like there was some very conservative priest who came to our town, and he started doing that and pushing it. But actually, it is part of so many religions, and when like covering up and covering women, etc. It's a different thing. But I think hijab became a political tool to say that Islam is oppressing women, to say that this kind of religion is stopping women from being who they are, where you are, like it's a symbol of everything, like Jennifer said. But for me, it's a political tool. It became politics because hijab became defying people, where people had to defend themselves because they wore them. It pushed people to wear them, and it pushed people to hate people who wear them. It's like it became a political. For me, it's politics. It became politics. It's regressed from all the other meanings. Because as a feminist or as a woman, I believe that wearing a headscarf, wearing a short, putting a tattoo, being gay, being straight, being a mother, being single are all forms of how a feminist could express herself in that sense. But for me, hijab now is very political. It stopped being all the other components where it's religious, it's private. Is it oppressed? Is it oppression? Is it freedom? Is it etc.? For me, it became a political thing where it became a statement against or a statement with. If you take Turkey, for example, Turkey is a striking example of how discourse, like Turkey and Iran, but I would say Turkey as well, because Turkey is a really confusing model for people who talk about like an Islamic state who are trying to, I don't know, to get back the Ottoman Empire at some point, but the Turkish hijab and using hijab there is something that it's like it became a political, for me, it's a political symbol that brings in so many things with it. It's like if you are with the hijab, then you are part of that culture, of that understanding, of that political stance. If you're not, then you are that something else. So it became, for me, it became an object that is used politically.
Interesting.
Palestinian friend of mine, she actually spoke about this, but with regards to Palestine, and she said that in her community in Palestine, she's like from Muslim background, and And she said there were only two women. You either wore hijab, or maybe it was a rural area. And she said you either wore hijab and then you were Muslim, or you didn't and then you were communist. And she said people were really confused when they asked her, what are you? And she said, I'm Muslim. But they were like, but you don't wear hijab. And then they said, are you communist? And she was like, no. And they were like, huh? And then after a while, she realized that there were only these two categories for them. So she said, well, next time when they asked her, are you communist? She was like,
I know that specific town, yes. It's very cultural ingrained as well. It's very country specific. I would again say I had experiences in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine, and I can tell you all what we discussed is very country specific in each country, and it has its own story.
Absolutely.
And yes, it's the same for us. For us in my town, we are a Christian minority in the big region of our governorate, but we have a Muslim minority within our country, within our village. So we are a Christian village, but we have a Muslim minority, but we are a minority village in a big combination of big villages. So all this controversy of understanding that, and if you were in my hometown, if you don't wear a scarf, then you're Christian. If not, you're Muslim. And I remember our Muslim neighbor, he was our only Muslim neighbor in our neighborhood, but because he is from this town, Muslims from an adjacent town, they would call him the Christian because he comes from our town. So it's all about, it's like the references. So they called him the Christian just because he's Muslim, but they call him the Christian because he came from our town. And it's all about that kind of impressions that you take, and then just like you stick all these stereotypes to people. You're either this or that.
Can I mention a point in response to Jennifer?
So interesting. I also, sorry, Osama, just one more thing quickly in response to what Laila just said. I also I grew up in an environment where if you wore hijab, you were in the minority, right? And I sometimes wonder if I had grown up in an environment where hijab is the norm.
It's prevalent, yeah.
Right, for women to wear. I sometimes wonder, would I wear it today? I sometimes really, really, really wonder. And I mean, there's part in me who says yes, I still would, because I believe in, there's the theological aspect, right? And I believe in that. But then there's also part of me who acknowledges how important society is and how important context is and how important our communities are. Yeah, so I think it's this question of minority, majority, right? It's a really, really, really interesting question.
I totally agree, but then the same question goes: if Muslims didn't feel threatened in Europe, would they be trying to show more that they are Muslims in these communities or not? And this reflects also, as a Christian, sometimes we try too hard to show how Christian we are because we are a minority in a majority of a Muslim community. So some young people resort to wearing big crosses or showing they are Christian somehow, wearing everything that has to do with that, or just bringing it up the first minute you ask them who they are, because they feel threatened, because their identity is threatened by this kind of stuff. So they try to show it more. And I think it's a very interesting question.
Very. I noticed this in Lebanon as well, where I saw African and Southeast Asian maids, right, who would work for rich Lebanese families. They arrived in Lebanon and they fairly quickly figured out that in Lebanon, in the dominant discourse, it was a good thing to be Christian, right? Because you're modern and you're progressive and you're not backwards like the Muslims, right? So then you had these maids who in terms of class and education, right? And race as well, right?
And you have to be, you have to be a specific type of Christian as well, not all Christians. You have to be also...
Yes, that's what I mean, Lebanon, definitely, right? But in terms of their race, their class, education, they were at the very bottom of the food chain. But then they realized that being Christian was actually of advantage.
Give them leverage.
Absolutely. And then you saw all these African and Southeast Asian maids walking around with the biggest crosses ever. And it was just so weird how they were trying to leverage one part of their identity and balance it out against another one. Fascinating, really, really fascinating.
Lebanon is a very interesting place, yes.
Well, I wanted to respond to Laila's, so I've got two responses. One to Laila.
Jumping after you.
All right, cool, cool. So in terms of, you asked, when did hijab become a symbol of oppression? When was it viewed as a symbol of oppression? Now, my instinctive answer is that the process began when Eurocentrism began, namely during the imperial age, during the Westphalian Treaty. Now, I know that at that time, Christian or secular non-Christian women still dressed differently to today. They still revealed, they still covered, they may have worn longer dresses than today or whatever it is. I'm aware of that, right? But that point there was when the world was viewed as anything that is Judeo-Christian or Western European is the norm, and anything that's not part of that culture is now suboptimal or different or exotic or oppressive even, okay? Now, when the norm began to change the way they express themselves, and when certain norms, social norms changed, for example, it became more acceptable, or as Jennifer rightly pointed out, in the 70s, it became a sign of empowerment and liberty to wear a miniskirt for some people. Then at that point, not doing that is suboptimal because it's not in the Eurocentric position. The Eurocentric position is the default position. And I think that is linked to why we now view hijab as an oppressive force, because simply it's not the way that Europeans express themselves. Obviously I'm expecting pushback on this point. The second point I want to make is in response to Jennifer, when you mentioned about choice. I agree with everything you've said in the discussion so far, except that one bit about choice. I think choice is overrated, actually. I think sometimes our choice leads us to oppress ourselves. Sometimes we make choices that are suboptimal and actually undermine our sense of liberty. Sometimes it's not about choice, it's about guidance. I think at the moment, there's this huge emphasis on the right thing. We rationalize things, and I understand why we do it, because it seems like the only option, even myself, right? We say, okay, how do we reconcile this? If wearing a hijab can be oppressive, but it can be liberating, and wearing a bikini can be oppressive and liberating, then how do you rationalize this? We say, okay, if you choose to wear either one, then you're liberated, right? But I don't think it's that clear cut, because if I take an extreme example where I choose to go down a career path or choose to have a certain lifestyle habits that undermine my liberty, then my choice is now redundant. So I'm not convinced that choice rationalizes the problem.
But Osama, who decides that? Who decides what is at your best interest? Like, someone might look at me and they might say, oh,
Patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, like we want to challenge that, right? And not just patriarchy, just like it could be society, it could be the community, or it could also be very individual, right? Like, you might look at me and you might be like, Jennifer, why do you choose to become a gardener? You could do better, you could become a lawyer, right? But it's my choice. So it's like, literally, I don't think it's a matter of of outsiders, right? To decide that. If a person,
Interesting.
I think there is another question here, Osama. So I think there's another question, and that is, how can you make choices if the information that is available to you is limited, right? How can you make choices if you live in an environment where you know that these choices are going to have consequences?
Interesting.
And I actually, there's another example from Palestine that comes to mind. Like, when we were in Palestine, we were in a group of both students from France and from Palestine. And there was a young woman from Palestine who was in our group. She was of our age, like in her early 20s, and she was wearing the headscarf, right? And then I noticed that we were going on trips, we were traveling from town to town, and I noticed that headscarf started going further back, right? And then at one point, it's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly how I approached the topic, but I think eventually I asked her about it and we started speaking about it, and it turned out that she did not actually want to wear it, right? So my initial reaction was like, look, take it off. take it off. We are your friends. We're all here together. No one is going to judge you. If anyone says anything, I'm going to have your back and I'm going to support you, right? But that did not take into account in any way that, I mean, she was still going to live there, right? And she was still going to go back home. And maybe there were people at home that she was worried about, right? So I think that's a factor to take into account, right? Like, are you worried about consequences? Are you worried what's going to happen when you start wearing hijab? Are you worried about what's going to happen when you stop wearing hijab, right?
I
So
think,
I might, yeah.
sorry to interrupt. I think it comes to mind what Sean was asking about Western and Middle Eastern patriarchy. The choice is like they impose a choice. They replace a choice. Like they replace a coercion with a coercion. It's like, you don't have to wear a hijab. Take my choice. And then that's not a choice anymore. So it's not about, so bringing in modernizations, like, you don't have to be like backwards, please modernize like us. But this is another enforcement of what I don't want. It's like it's stopping you from choosing who you are, and struggling. And it goes back also to your identity, and bringing into what you said, Jennifer, about this girl. And this is what happens in Palestinian cities and towns. Girls sometimes wear hijabs because their family want them to, and or maybe they're pushed. Like, for example, I heard, like, my friends, like, when you go into a public school and you're not wearing a hijab, you get pushed and you get bullied somehow, or you get oppressed into wearing one, because you would be somehow different and you would be cast aside if you don't. And this is the struggle that becomes it. So it doesn't become a choice, but then you defend it when you are on the other side with other people. So maybe you don't like wearing hijab when you are in Palestine, but if you become a refugee in a Western country, then hijab becomes part of your identity. You become defensive, then you wear it because you want to show people that you are Muslim. You want you wearing your hijab because of this and this and this and that. So that kind of struggle that happens. But in the comment of what Osama has said, it's replacing a coercion with the coercion. It's never a choice for a woman. If you're saying that she should be wearing a hijab, she's being oppressed by Islam, let's give her freedom to choose not to wear it. But then you're not giving her a choice, you're giving her another option that you think it's a choice, but actually it's your choice, not hers.
Yes, I agree.
And that's a difference.
But then at the same time, I mean, I do believe that there are situations where people actually make a genuine choice.
Absolutely.
I do believe that still exists.
Shatha?
I think I don't know. I don't want to butcher your name. Is it Riyaz? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
I think you wanted to say something, so just want to give you the floor.
Appreciate it. Yeah. So I think what a lot of the personal experiences have been speaking to is the various attempts to navigate modernity. So I think there's a few themes that was brought up, and I was listening in to the whole conversation. It's an interesting discussion, and this is one of those things. Is how it is modernity is navigated, whether it's in Lebanon to London. I think the MENA region as a whole, but as far as I'm concerned, is undergoing a nation building process. And unfortunately, post decolonization, post liberation for the MENA region, this has occurred due to the incessant intervention by NATO or the US and her allies and her NATO allies. So this has obviously kind of brought to the fore a lot of the underlying issues, exacerbated with all the trappings of the US war machine. Just two more points I wanted to make. When the juggernaut of the kind of colonialist project arrived on the Mediterranean, Europe, it has to be remembered, had undergone its nation building process or its project of nation building, and it had undergone some 500 years of bloody nation building, and that's important to note, to kind of compare as to perhaps where the MENA region is. But it's just to wrap up with this again, the discussion developed naturally to the point where there was recognition of even local variations, and I think here is a parallel between Europe and the MENA region, in that Europe as a subcontinent, if you will, or Western Asia, however that you want to term it, is very localized in terms of its expression, in terms of its cultural expressions and all that entails. And you just need to look at a cursory look at the kind of romantic genre, or whether it's Goethe or other writers who mentioned, even like in the kind of the greater German region, the kind of variation between a place in, say, Cologne and Dusseldorf, for example. And this kind of is mirrored in, for example, the MENA region, where you have local variations, local dialects, and that's so. Yeah, just to wrap it up, I think this, if we kind of address the romantic notions we may have of history of our present condition, that way we can kind of start to think about ways in which we engage with, especially for us in the diaspora, ways in which we meaningfully engage with the democratic institutions, especially if we want to move forward past identity politics, which is another important thing that was brought up just now in the discussion. So I'll leave it there and bring everyone else in.
I think Ziriab makes an important point. So, which was essentially what I wanted to say, which is that I think that colonialism has contributed to how we define what is a liberating force for women and what is an oppressing force for women. I also want to mention that I agree with what Jennifer said, which is that a choice is right because it's a choice, and there isn't some kind of objective standard which renders, which I just wanted to. The thing is, like when I recognize a philosophical or theoretical problem with an argument, I like to mention it because it can be corrected. And now my views have refined because I mentioned it, and you've pushed back, which was useful. So thank you.
We're always happy to help with your thinking process, Osama, at your service. Your 3 favorite women.
Yes, it's difficult at times to manage, but but I try. So yeah, thank you.
I think, Osama, considering that we have been sitting here for 2.5 hours now, we're actually all doing fine.
Yes.
So I have a point, please, to make here.
Sure.
It's very great listening to all these well-grounded and well-rounded also perspectives and views. But also there is an issue that I have observed when it comes to any academic approach. Sometimes when it deals with or when it tries to fathom social related issues, when it comes to faith or when it comes to a belief system, most often my observation is this usually comes at the cost of the understanding of this faith or this tradition in its own terms as well. And let me build on the paper and what I shared with you about it. So I think when it comes to hijab in particular, we need to draw a distinction between what it means within a faith tradition, basically, because you understand that within every faith tradition or within every belief system, or what we can be referring to as the religious phenomenon, always there is a jurisprudence that states or that clarifies what is the point of having this. Okay, so this is a very important point, that we draw a distinction between this understanding and on one hand, and then the politicization that would occur, the different contexts that it can be used into or manipulated even sometimes, but ignoring totally what it means originally in this tradition, irrespective of what it is, be it here because of talking about hijab, Islam or Christianity or Judaism or any other faith, tradition or belief. We cannot totally ignore what it means in this based on the jurisprudence, and then the politicization that can happen into this. So with having such balanced approach, I think then we can reach more in-depth analysis of the phenomenon at hand.
Sure, and I guess we will have I think it's important to have a separate discussion about this, about jurisprudence and gender and Islam. So maybe we can talk about this later today or tomorrow, either one of those. I'm happy to do. But yeah, but thank you so much. I'm just conscious that Jennifer, Laila, and Shatha need to wrap up. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Osama. I would like, I'd love these discussions to go on. We need to make this a regular session. Really, it's really helpful, and learning from all of you guys, listening to you is very mind-opening, to be honest. But I want to challenge Osama. And one thing as well, in this kind of stuff, we will finish off like we started, Jennifer, is like, being nice is not always the good thing. Sometimes we need to challenge respectfully a way where we say, we don't think, as like, I don't believe that we need to say, yes, all religions and its own opinions. But yes, we need to be firm on some of the things that we believe that have been destructively used, whether by religious faiths or by cultures or by politics or by institutions or by individuals to do such stuff to, especially to women. We need to stand up sometimes and say, this has been used wrong, or this is wrong. And
Agreed.
It's not only about saying that it's only a perspective, it is, and respecting everybody, but sometimes standing firm on some things needs to be said for it to become like really out there. It's like I prefer to be called like, you are strong, you're saying things that you shouldn't have. But I think we need to get to that level for us to think that this is the level we need to start up with, rather than going really basic and then going very soft. Sometimes I think we need to be more firm and saying that, and having the safe space to say that, even in a religious setting or in a cultural setting or political setting where it's not always safe, unfortunately.
I agree.